The Texas sun was just coming up, spilling that orange-pink light across the rooftops like God himself had taken a paintbrush to the sky. It was a Thursday, and Thursdays used to mean something to me. Thursdays meant cobbler in the oven by noon, fresh laundry hanging on the line, and my grandson climbing into my lap with sticky hands and a smile that could fix any bad day. That morning, I was thinking about peaches. They were in season, and I had been planning to make my late husband's favorite peach cobbler recipe for dinner. I walked up the street with my little green market cart, the one with the stubborn left wheel that wobbled like an old man's knee. I had pushed that cart down this road hundreds of times in the last 4 years. I knew every crack in the pavement, every dog that barked from behind a fence, every neighbor's front garden that changed with the seasons. I even knew which porch steps creaked under your feet when you went up them. My house had 3 creaks. I loved those creaks. They made the place feel alive. But that morning, something felt off before I even reached the driveway. It was like the air had gone heavy, even though the sun was bright and the sky was clear. I slowed my steps without meaning to, my eyes scanning ahead. At first, I thought maybe someone had delivered a big package, or maybe there had been a garage sale I forgot about. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a package. It wasn't a sale. It was my life, sitting out there for anyone to see. The porch was crowded with boxes. Not 1 or 2, 10, maybe 12, all stacked neatly, almost politely, as if whoever did this wanted it to look organized. Some boxes were sealed with tape, others were just folded closed, but I didn't need to open them to know what was inside. My handwriting was staring back at me from the sides: winter sweaters, photo albums, kitchen tools, moms, labels I had written over the years in careful black marker. I froze at the edge of the walkway. My hands tightened around the handle of my cart until my knuckles ached. There, sitting in the sun like it was worthless, was my red kettle, the one I'd boiled water in every single morning for decades. Next to it was the Afghan I had crocheted during the winter my husband was sick, folded in a box like a forgotten rag. I spotted a stack of picture frames. One had a photo of me and my husband, young and laughing at a backyard barbecue long before the gray hair, long before the empty chair at the table. Another frame held a picture of our son dressed as a cowboy, smiling with a gap-toothed grin. All of it was mine, and all of it was sitting outside, in the Texas heat, like a pile of donations outside a thrift store. On top of one box, a piece of paper fluttered in the warm breeze. I knew before I even touched it that it was a note. I stepped closer and saw the words written in a handwriting that wasn't mine. "Thanks for everything, but we need the space." That was it. No name, no signature, no goodbye. Just those 7 words, like they were doing me a favor. I heard the creak of the front door before I had time to process the note. She stepped out first. My daughter-in-law, wearing yoga pants and a tank top, holding a cup of coffee like this was just another casual morning. Her eyes met mine, and there was not 1 ounce of guilt in them. She took a sip, then said, "We'll send your mail. Please don't make this harder than it already is." I wanted to laugh at the word harder. Harder for who? For her, who had just decided to put me out like old furniture. Behind her, my son appeared, taller than me, broader than he was as a boy, but somehow smaller than he had ever been. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring at the porch rail like he wished he was anywhere else. I waited. I waited for him to speak, to tell me this was a mistake, to tell me they'd fix it. But he didn't. He stayed quiet, letting her words be the only ones. My chest felt tight, but I swallowed down everything I wanted to scream. I didn't say, "Tell her this isn't right." I didn't say, "After everything I've done for you." I didn't even say his name. Instead, I turned to the boxes. The sweaters on top were ones I had knitted during colder winters when my fingers were still strong. I picked up the box and held it close to my chest. No one moved to help me. No one asked if I had somewhere to go. I loaded what I could into a neighbor's borrowed car, and what didn't fit, I left behind. Some memories are too heavy to carry when your heart is already breaking. The air on the porch smelled faintly of lavender candles, her favorite. She always said she liked the smell because it made the house feel fresh. To me, it smelled like she was covering something up. Maybe she had been covering this up for a long time. I thought about the last 4 years. I had moved in when they were drowning in debt, when their house was barely livable for a child, let alone a family. I sold my grocery store, the one I had, poured my life into, and gave them almost everything I had. My savings, my retirement, my future. I cooked their meals, cleaned their floors, picked up their boy from school, and nursed him when they were too busy. I thought I was part of the family. They saw me as space to be cleared. I got into the car without looking back at the house. If I did, I wasn't sure I'd be able to drive away. I kept my eyes forward as we turned the corner, the boxes in the back seat rattling softly with every bump in the road. By the time I reached Ruth's florist shop, the shock had settled in my bones. Ruth was a widow who had lost her husband 5 years ago. She rented out a small room above the shop to travelers or anyone who needed a place. When I walked in, she took one look at me and didn't ask a single question. She just handed me a key, a blanket, and a cup of warm tea. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. I sat on the edge of the bed in that little upstairs room, my suitcase by my feet, and let the truth wash over me. They had taken my home. They had taken my place at the table. They had taken the future I thought we'd share. And they had done it with a single note. That night, as the shop downstairs grew quiet and the scent of fresh roses drifted up through the floorboards, I opened my suitcase. On top of my folded clothes was a small tin box I had kept hidden in the back of the closet behind the winter blankets. Inside were 2 things they hadn't taken because they didn't know they existed. One was a stack of old photographs bound with twine. The other was a red leather notebook, soft at the corners from years of use. I ran my fingers over the cover of the notebook. Every page inside was a record, every payment I had made toward that house, every repair I had covered, every tax bill I had paid when they couldn't. And tucked in the very back was a letter in my husband's shaky handwriting. It wasn't notarized, but it was real. "If anything happens to me, this house is hers. She built it. I just signed the papers." I closed the notebook and set it on the nightstand. My hands were steady now. They thought they had ended everything with that note on the porch. They were wrong. That note wasn't the end. It was the start. The morning after I found my life scattered on the porch, the world felt like it had lost its sound. The birds still chirped outside my window. The wind still moved through the tall Texas grass. But inside the small one-room motel I had checked into, there was nothing but a hollow quiet. My ears strained for a familiar noise, the hum of my kitchen refrigerator, the thud of boots by the front door, the faint creak in the hallway that had always made the house feel alive. Now, those sounds belonged to a place I was no longer welcome in. I lay on the stiff motel bed staring at the water stains on the ceiling. I had never once thought I would end up here, in a space that smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. With my clothes folded in plastic grocery bags on the chair, the house I had made a home for 32 years was only 5 miles away, but it may as well have been across the ocean. It wasn't just the loss of the walls that hurt. It was the way it had been done, quietly, efficiently, without warning. The note had said, "Thanks for everything." But those words, instead of gratitude, felt like the final shove out the door. Whoever had written it didn't even have the courage to sign their name. I thought about going back that morning. Not to fight or argue, I knew they would expect me to. I imagined their faces braced for a confrontation. But I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me beg for what was mine. Still, a part of me needed to know what was happening in that house without me. Were they already moving my furniture? Had they thrown away my photographs? So I drove. I took the old truck, the one my husband had bought before he passed, the one with the bench seat that was worn in the middle from years of us riding side by side. The drive felt longer than I remembered. Every mile made my chest feel tighter. When I turned onto the dirt road leading to the house, I slowed down. My eyes scanned the front yard. The porch was empty now, except for the rocking chair I had bought at a flea market in Lubbock years ago. My rocking chair, but it wasn't rocking anymore. It sat still, like it knew I wasn't coming to sit in it again. I parked far enough away that they wouldn't hear the engine. I just sat there in the truck, watching. The curtains in the living room were open. I could see shadows moving inside a tall figure, a smaller one beside it. Laughter floated out faintly when the wind shifted. That was the hardest part, knowing life was continuing in my home, and I was no part of it. For a long time, I stayed there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind played back every moment that led up to this. The slow erosion of kindness. The quick snapping in voices where once there had been warmth. The way they had started making decisions without telling me. Little ones at first, then bigger. Until one morning they decided I didn't belong in my own life anymore. I finally forced myself to drive away, but I didn't go back to the motel. I went to the church. The church had always been my anchor. Not because I was overly religious, I'd always been more private about my faith, but because the building felt steady, unmoving, in a world that never stopped shifting. I knew I'd find Pastor Henry in his office. Sure enough, when I pushed open the heavy wooden door, I saw him behind the desk, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he read over the bulletin for Sunday. "Jean," he said, looking up with a smile that faltered when he saw my face. "What happened?" I told him everything. I told him about the porch, the bags, the note. I told him how I didn't even know who had left it, but I had a sinking feeling I did. I told him how my body ached in a way that had nothing to do with age, but with the weight of being discarded. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk. When I was done, he leaned back and said, "You don't have to decide anything today, but you do need to decide whether you want to fight for that house or walk away." "I don't know if I have the fight left in me," I admitted. "You do," he said, so certain it made me wonder if he saw something in me I had forgotten was there. "But this isn't just about a house. It's about who you are when people try to take away your place in the world." His words stayed with me long after I left. The sun was starting to dip low by the time I drove back to the motel. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the bags by the chair. My whole life in plastic sacks. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch. I saw the note. I saw the shadows moving inside my living room. By dawn, I made up my mind. I didn't know how yet, but I wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. If they thought they could erase me with a note and a shove out the door, they were about to find out they'd underestimated the wrong woman. I stared at the note on the kitchen table long after my morning coffee had gone cold. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Linda's, my daughter-in-law's neat, curling script, the same style I had seen on birthday cards she used to sign for me when she still pretended to care. The same writing that once spelled out, "Love you, Mom," now spelled something entirely different. "Mary, it's best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while. We need space to figure things out. Your things are already packed. We wish you the best." I read it again, slower this time, letting each word burn into my mind like a brand. It wasn't the words "for a while" that struck me the hardest. It was "already packed." I felt a strange stillness settle over me, the kind that comes when a storm is about to break but hasn't yet. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't cry out. Instead, I folded the note and placed it beside my coffee cup as if it were just a grocery list. Then I got up, grabbed my sweater from the back of the chair, and walked outside. The boxes sat on the porch in uneven stacks, taped up with mismatched strips that looked rushed. A few were crushed on one side, the cardboard bowed from whatever had been shoved inside. On the top box sat my old blue quilt, the one I'd hand-stitched with my mother in 1974, back when we still had winters cold enough to keep you under 2 blankets. I picked it up and pressed it to my chest, feeling the worn fabric against my skin. A sharp wind blew across the yard, sending one of the smaller boxes tumbling sideways. A corner ripped, and a handful of photographs slid out onto the porch boards. I knelt down to gather them, and that's when I saw the one of Daniel, my son, at 8 years old, standing in the middle of a little league field with his glove too big for his hand and a grin that could melt the heart of any stranger. My throat tightened. I didn't just see the boy in the picture. I saw the years between that boy and the man who had stood by while Linda wrote that note. I saw the teenage version of him, stomping through the kitchen in muddy boots, asking if I could drive him to the hardware store because he needed one more piece for his school project. I saw the 20-year-old version, calling me from his college dorm to say he'd met someone special. That someone had been Linda. I gathered the photographs carefully, sliding them back into the torn box, and carried it inside. The kitchen felt smaller now. My coffee was still sitting there, but it looked like it belonged to someone else's morning. I sat down and unfolded the note again, searching for any sign of kindness, any hint that this wasn't as final as it felt. But there was none, I thought. Back to the day I moved in with them. Daniel had insisted it was the right choice. "You'll have your own room," he'd said. "It'll be easier for everyone. You won't have to worry about yard work or the roof or anything like that." I'd sold my little house at his urging, letting go of the place I'd lived in for 42 years. Every stick of furniture, every curtain, every memory gone in one estate sale weekend. And now here I was, no home, no room, no place that was mine. Just a pile of boxes on the porch and a note that told me to go. I poured the coffee down the sink and rinsed the cup out. The action was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was the last thing I would clean in that kitchen. By noon, I had called a taxi. The driver, a young man with a baseball cap pulled low, asked where I was headed. I gave him the address of a small motel on the edge of town. He glanced at my boxes and then at me but didn't ask questions. The motel room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. It had one bed, one chair, and a small table with a lamp that flickered when I turned it on. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall, wondering how everything had shifted so suddenly. I unpacked only one box that night, the one with the quilt, my Bible, and the framed picture of my late husband, Robert. I set the picture on the table, draped the quilt over the bed, and placed the Bible beside the lamp. The rest of the boxes stayed stacked in the corner, silent and accusing. It was in that motel room that the weight of what had happened truly settled in. My son hadn't just let his wife send me away. He'd agreed to it. He'd watched her pack my life into cardboard and carry it to the porch. He'd stood by while she taped the last box shut. I lay awake most of the night, staring at the quilt's familiar stitches. My mind replayed conversations from the past year, little remarks from Linda that I'd brushed off at the time. "It's hard having more than 2 adults in the house," she'd once said over dinner. "We all need privacy." Or, "Sometimes it feels like you've taken over my kitchen." I had laughed back then, thinking she was only half serious. Now I understood. In the morning, I made a decision. I wouldn't call Daniel, not yet. I wouldn't beg him to explain or to take me back. Instead, I would start writing everything down, every memory, every slight, every piece of this story. If they wanted me gone, fine, but they would not erase me. I walked to the corner store and bought a cheap notebook and a pen. Back in the motel room, I sat down at the small table, opened to the first page, and wrote the date. Then I began with the sentence that had been echoing in my head since I found the note. My belongings were packed on the porch, and my son let it happen. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my rooster crowing out back. The familiar call used to bring me comfort, but now it only reminded me that life was carrying on without asking if I was ready to follow along. I pulled myself out of bed, my body aching from both the cold draft that seeped through the thin curtains and the weight of thoughts I carried. I set the kettle on for tea and glanced at the boxes stacked against the far wall of my new living space. It still felt foreign, this cramped guest house on the edge of Mrs. Alvarez's property. She had offered it to me without hesitation, a kindness I didn't have words for at the time. I owed her my sanity. A sharp knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, there stood Mrs. Alvarez herself, a short woman with silver hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. She had a coat draped over her arm. "You didn't take the one I left yesterday," she said, stepping inside before I could invite her. "It's going to get cold tonight. You can't keep wearing that thin cardigan." I smiled faintly and took the coat from her. "You've already done enough. Don't start that talk with me," she said, waving her hand. "I came because I think you need to hear something." I stiffened. My instinct told me this was about my family. "What is it?" She hesitated, then glanced at the boxes. "Last night, I saw your son and his wife." They were at your old house. My stomach tightened. Doing what? Clearing out the rest of your things. Not just the furniture they said you could keep. They were loading up the sewing machine, the quilts, even the old rocking chair from your porch. My mouth went dry. That rocking chair wasn't just a piece of wood and nails, it was where I'd nursed my son when he was sick, where I'd sat with his father during long summer evenings, where I'd watched sunsets while thinking, life couldn't get more perfect. They took it all? She nodded. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but yes. I gripped the edge of the table. Did they say anything? They were talking to a man I didn't recognize. I think he was from the pawn shop in town. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. They weren't just taking my belongings for themselves, they were selling them. I had become nothing more than a source of quick cash. Mrs. Alvarez reached out and placed her hand over mine. You don't deserve this. I know, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Knowing didn't change anything. It didn't. Give me back my home, my chair, or my dignity. She studied me for a long moment before speaking again. I've lived here long enough to know when something is wrong. That note they left you, it wasn't just about moving you out. It was about erasing you. The truth of her words settled into me like ice. Erasing me, wiping away my place in that house, in their lives, in the history we'd built together. I had given them everything, and in return, they had stripped me down to nothing. Why would they do this? I asked, though I knew no answer could make it right. Mrs. Alvarez's lips pressed into a thin line. Greed, pride. Sometimes it's not even about needing the money. It's about control. Control. That word echoed in my mind. They had taken control of my home, my belongings, and even my narrative. But there was still one thing they didn't have: the full truth of me. That, I realized, might be my last weapon. I spent the afternoon in a kind of restless haze. I unpacked a few things from the boxes, setting out a framed photo of my late husband and me, the edges worn from years of being held. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Alvarez had said. Her words had planted a seed, and it was growing into something fierce. That evening, I decided to walk past my old house. I told myself it was just to see if the curtains were still, the ones I had sewn, but deep down, I wanted proof of what they had done. The street was quiet except for the hum of a television coming from a neighbor's window. When I reached the driveway, my breath caught. The porch light was on, casting a golden glow over the steps where my rocking chair used to sit. In its place was nothing but a dark patch where the wood had faded unevenly. The space looked wrong, like a smile with a missing tooth. Through the window, I saw my son moving about the living room. His wife sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Neither looked toward the window, and I didn't linger long enough for them to notice me. As I turned away, I caught sight of something that made my chest tighten. A new rug rolled out across the living room floor. I recognized it instantly. It had been in my bedroom for over 20 years. Walking back to the guest house, I felt a mixture of sorrow and heat rising in me. They could take my belongings, but they couldn't take my memories. And if they wanted to erase me, then I had to make sure my story was told in a way they couldn't ignore. When I returned, Mrs. Alvarez was waiting on the porch of the guest house, a mug of tea in her hands. I thought you might need this. I took it gratefully. You were right. About what? They're not just moving on without me. They're rewriting the story so I was never there. Mrs. Alvarez's eyes narrowed. Then you better make sure they can't. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words from the note burned in my mind. Thanks for everything. It wasn't gratitude. It was a period at the end of a sentence they thought was finished. But my story wasn't over. The house felt different when I stepped inside that morning. It was not mine anymore, but the air still carried the faint scent of cinnamon from the potpourri I used to keep in a glass bowl by the window. I could still see the faint scratches on the wooden doorframe where I had marked Jake's height each year. The pencil line stopped abruptly at age 12, the year his father passed away. After that, neither of us felt like measuring time that way anymore. I had been granted exactly 2 hours to retrieve personal items from the house. They had sent that notice in writing, like I was some stranger they were tolerating. A cousin of my late husband, who now claimed to have some authority in the matter, would supervise my visit. It was meant to be civil, but the tone was clear. Hurry, take what you can carry, and leave quietly. I walked slowly through the hallway, letting my fingertips glide over the walls as if touching the skin of an old friend. Every dent, every uneven coat of paint had a story. I passed by the living room, where the curtains were drawn tight. Sunlight used to pour through those windows in the mornings, waking me before my coffee. Now, the room felt cold, staged, like a place set for someone else's life. My shoes clicked against the wooden floor. Each sound echoed in the stillness. I reached the kitchen first. The cabinet stood open, emptied of the plates, glasses, and mugs I had collected over decades. My floral teapot was gone. The one Jake had bought me for Mother's Day when he was 16 was nowhere to be found. I opened every cupboard, hoping maybe they had just moved it aside. But no, the shelves were bare except for a single chipped cup, not even mine, and a jar of instant coffee I would never drink. I could feel the weight pressing behind my ribs, grief mixing with a strange kind of anger. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, heavy kind that builds until you have to do something, anything, to let it out. From the kitchen window, I could see the back porch. That's where Jake used to sit with me on summer nights, watching fireflies. While I told him stories about my childhood in a little Texas town no one could find on a map. Those nights were golden, glowing in my memory like the jars we filled with those tiny blinking lights. But now the porch was empty, swept clean as if erasing those years was as easy as a broom's stroke. I moved to the hallway closet. My old winter coat was still there, smelling faintly of cedar from the blocks I kept in the pockets. I pulled it down and hugged it to my chest, more for the comfort than the need to take it. Next to it hung Jake's high school letterman jacket. That stopped me cold. It had his name stitched in red thread on the front and smelled faintly of the cologne he wore back then. Why had they left this? Did they forget it was here? Or did they think it meant nothing to me? The idea that anyone could think this jacket was meaningless made my throat tighten. I took it down carefully, folding it as if it were made of glass. In the master bedroom, the bed was stripped bare. The quilt I had hand-stitched during the first year of my marriage was gone. The nightstand drawers were empty except for a small photograph I recognized instantly, my wedding day. It was a little faded, the corners bent from years in that drawer. I picked it up and studied it. My husband's smile in that photo was wide and unguarded, the way he only smiled when he was with me. I could almost hear his laugh. I slipped the photo into my coat pocket. Every room was a piece of my life, now hollowed out. I kept looking for things they might have missed, a hidden box, a forgotten trinket, but each discovery was smaller than the last. A single earring without its pair, a paperback novel with my handwriting in the margins, a cracked vase. I had almost finished my round when I opened the door to the attic stairs. Dust rose in the beam of light as I climbed. Up there, the air was dry and heavy, filled with that faint smell of wood and age. In the far corner sat a single box I knew immediately. It was the one I kept labeled simply keepsakes. I crouched down and lifted the lid. Inside were the birthday cards Jake had made me as a little boy, written in uneven crayon letters. "I love you, Mom, best mom ever." I ran my fingers over the paper, as if I could touch the little boy who wrote them. Underneath the cards was a small tin. Inside it, my husband's old pocket watch rested on a piece of cloth. He had carried that watch every day until the day he died. I wound it gently. The ticking sound filled the attic, small but steady, like a heartbeat. I stayed there for a while, sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor, surrounded by the fragments of my life that had survived the purge. It was quiet, except for the watch. That ticking made me realize something: no matter how much they took, no matter how bare they left the rooms, time kept moving. And I was still here. When I came down from the attic, the cousin was waiting by the door. He checked his watch and cleared his throat. "You've got 15 minutes, he said flatly. I looked around one last time. This was not my home anymore. The walls still remembered me, but the people in it had decided I no longer belonged. I carried my coat, the letterman jacket, the wedding photo, the keepsake box, and the pocket watch to my car. Each item felt heavier than it should have, not because of the weight, but because of the memories pressed into them. Before I drove away, I sat behind the wheel and looked at the house. I thought of the laughter it had held, the arguments, the dinners, the birthdays. I thought of the little boy who used to run through the hallway, his feet pounding the same wood that now stood silent. Then I turned the key and left, not just the house, not just the porch where they had once left my belongings with that note. I left the idea that home could only be built in one place. They had taken the building, but they could not take the years I had lived in it. Those were mine. And somewhere, maybe in a small house on a quiet street or in a place I had yet to see, I would build again. The Texas sun was relentless that afternoon, beating down on my little rented porch as if determined to make me remember every choice that had led me here. The cicadas screamed in the distance, their endless chorus somehow louder than the thud of my heart. I sat at my small kitchen table, a chipped piece of furniture salvaged from a yard sale, staring at a blank sheet of paper in front of me. It had been weeks since the day my life was turned upside down. Weeks since I had stood there on my own porch, looking down at a pile of my belongings dumped like someone was taking out the trash. Weeks since I had found that note, just 7 words, each one a blade that said, "Thanks for everything, now leave us be." I still kept that note in a drawer, not because I wanted to, but because throwing it away felt like letting them win. And I had not decided yet if I was ready to lose. Today, though, I was not looking at that note. I was staring at a blank page, wondering if I could put into words what was burning inside me. Not for them, not anymore, but for me. The truth was, I had been raised to believe you never air your family's dirty laundry. You kept it neat and folded, even if the fabric was torn. But at 62, sitting alone in a kitchen where the hum of the refrigerator was my only company, I realized something. My silence had been their shelter. My politeness had been their shield. I uncapped my pen and began to write. It started simple, a date at the top, my own handwriting firm but shaking. Then the words began to flow, first like a slow drip, then like a river breaking a dam. I wrote about the first time my daughter-in-law had made me feel small. It was over something so petty I almost laughed. Now, a pie I had brought to Thanksgiving. She had taken one look at it, frowned, and said, "We don't really eat store-bought. But thanks anyway." I had baked that pie from scratch. I wrote about the time my son had come to me asking for money, promising it was just a loan. I had given it without hesitation. That was 2 years ago. I had not seen a penny since. I wrote about the slow way they had pushed me to the edges of their life, how invitations became rare, phone calls shorter, smiles tighter, until one day, there was no edge left to stand on, and I was simply gone from their world. Halfway through writing, I stopped and looked at the clock. 2 hours had passed. My hand ached, my eyes burned, but my chest felt lighter than it had in months. I realized then that this letter, long, raw, unfiltered, was not a plea. I was not asking for them to understand me. I was not even asking for an apology. This was a record, a ledger of every cut, every bruise, every moment I had swallowed. Hurt to keep the peace. The sun began to set, pouring gold light across my kitchen floor. I kept writing. Memories that had been buried deep came to the surface. The time they moved without telling me, leaving me to find out from a neighbor. The Christmas when my gift to my grandson was returned to me in the mail because he already had one. And then, without realizing it, I wrote about the porch. The image came back sharp and cruel, my suitcase leaning against the railing, my quilt folded wrong, my books stacked carelessly, the note placed right on top, like a final flourish. I remembered how my knees had almost buckled, how I had stood there hoping it was a mistake, hoping someone would run out and say, "This isn't what it looks like." But no one came. By the time I finished writing, it was dark. My kitchen smelled faintly of the candle I had lit earlier, the one with the lavender scent. I read over the pages, 10 of them, front and back, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had taken something back. The letter sat there, heavy with truth. I did not know what I would do with it yet. Send it? Burn it? Hide it away? All I knew was that I had spoken in ink what I could not say in person. Before bed, I slid the letter into an envelope. I did not seal it. Not yet. I left it in the center of the table, a quiet witness to the night. As I lay in bed, I thought about how strange it was that the act of writing could make you feel both wounded and whole. My family might have put me on that porch, but tonight, I had put them on paper, and somehow, that felt like the first step toward reclaiming my life. Somewhere out there, in the deep Texas dark, the people who had once been my home were probably sleeping soundly. They had no idea that the woman they thought they had discarded was sitting in a small house, with a pen and paper, quietly starting a war they did not even know was coming. And I promised myself, as I drifted toward sleep, that I would never again be the kind of woman who accepted a note on a porch as the end of her story. The morning sun had barely risen when I stepped out of my small rented apartment, clutching the battered leather bag that held every piece of evidence I had managed to gather over the past few weeks. My heart was pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and determination coursing through my veins. Today was the day I would face James in court. Today, the truth would either save me or bury me. I had barely slept. My mind replayed the images of my belongings thrown on the porch like I was nothing more than an unwanted guest in my own life. That note, "Thanks for everything," still sat folded inside my bag, stained with a faint coffee ring from the morning I found it. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the starting gun for the battle that brought me here. The courthouse in Dallas stood like a stern reminder of justice and its price. As I walked through its heavy glass doors, the smell of polished wood and faint disinfectant wrapped around me. My lawyer, Paula, met me in the hallway. She was short, fierce, and spoke like every sentence could win a war. "You ready?" she asked, scanning me up and down. "You look strong. That's good. We want them to underestimate you." I nodded, clutching my bag tighter. "I'm ready, or at least I have to be." Inside the courtroom, James was already seated at the defendant's table with his lawyer, a tall man in a pinstriped suit who looked like he was born to argue. James didn't glance my way. His hair was slicked back, his shoulders squared, and his expression was the same cold indifference I had seen when I first confronted him after finding my things on the porch. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. His presence alone demanded silence. Once we were seated, Paula opened with a calm but cutting statement. "Your Honor, this is a case about betrayal, about a man who took advantage of a woman's trust, and about the property that was unlawfully taken from her. We will present proof both written and recorded that my client was removed from her own home without proper notice, without consent, and without cause." James's lawyer countered with a smug smile. "Your Honor, this is a case about a woman who was offered kindness and hospitality but became unreasonable, refusing to leave a home she no longer had any legal right to occupy." Every word from him felt like a knife twisting in my gut, but Paula squeezed my arm under the table, a silent reminder not to let my emotions boil over. The first witness was Mrs. Albright, my elderly neighbor from across the street. She walked slowly to the stand, gripping the rail for support, but her voice was steady. "I saw it happen," she told the court. "I saw James and two men carry her boxes to the porch. I asked him why she wasn't moving them herself, and he told me she didn't need to know what was going on." Paula smiled at the jury as if to say, "There it is." When it was my turn to speak, my palms were damp, but I kept my eyes locked on the judge. I described everything. The morning I returned home to find my life boxed up like trash, the cold finality of that note, the missing heirlooms that were never returned. I made sure my voice didn't shake when I spoke about the quilts my grandmother had sewn, now gone without a trace. James's lawyer tried to rattle me. "Isn't it true that you had no formal ownership of the house?" he asked. "I had an agreement with James that I could live there as long as I maintained the property and paid for the utilities," I replied firmly. "We may not have signed a paper, but that was our agreement for over 5 years. I kept my end." When court recessed for lunch, I stepped outside into the sunlight, breathing in the hot Texas air as if it might give me strength. Paula joined me, sipping her coffee. "They're trying to paint you as someone who overstayed her welcome," she said, "but you're coming across as honest. The jury is listening." Inside my chest, hope flickered, but I knew this fight wasn't over. That afternoon, Paula introduced the most damning piece of evidence, a text message from James to one of his friends, bragging about finally getting rid of the old lady and keeping the place for himself. The jury's eyes widened as the words were read aloud. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, James was avoiding my gaze entirely. I could feel the tide shifting, but the weight of years of betrayal still hung heavy on me. Winning in court would not erase what had been done, but it would be the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. As I left the courthouse, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows on the steps. I wasn't walking away with victory yet, but for the first time since that cruel morning on the porch, I felt the ground under my feet again. This fight was far from finished, but I would see it through to the end. I woke before dawn that Thursday, the Texas sky still painted with the last of the stars. The house felt heavy, not in the literal sense, but in that quiet way when you know something is coming, and it's not going to be good. I had spent the last few days making my presence known again in the community. I attended the church luncheon, showed up at the farmer's market, even spoke to the ladies from the historical society. Every step was deliberate. I wasn't hiding anymore. My family had made it clear they wanted me erased, pushed out like an old photograph that didn't match the frame anymore. But I wasn't about to be forgotten. By 6 o'clock a.m., I was already sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, my notebook open in front of me. I had been writing down every single thing that happened since the morning I found my belongings on the porch. Dates, times, what was said, who was present. I knew from my years as a schoolteacher that the smallest detail can matter the most. And if they thought they could paint me as some confused old woman who imagined things, they were in for a rude awakening. The knock on the door came just after sunrise. It wasn't friendly. It was sharp and quick, like someone wanted to get it over with. I opened it to find Daniel standing there, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who wished he was anywhere else. Behind him stood his wife, Amanda, arms crossed, face tight. "Mom," Daniel began, "we need to talk." Those 4 words have been the start of more heartbreak in my life than I care to admit. I stepped aside, letting them in. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, but I could feel it. This wasn't a visit to reconcile. Amanda didn't waste a second. "We've talked it over, and we think it's best for everyone if you stop telling people about the porch incident." I stared at her. "You mean stop telling the truth?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're blowing this out of proportion. People are talking. It's making us look bad. Daniel has clients who..." I cut her off. "Daniel has a mother who was treated like an unwanted stray. And if people are talking, maybe they should be." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, you know we didn't mean for it to come across that way. But you've been, well, making a scene. We just want to move past it." My blood boiled, but I kept my voice calm. "You want me to move past it so you can bury it. You want me to be quiet so you can pretend it never happened." Amanda's eyes flashed. "It's for your own good. People will start thinking you're bitter, or what?" I said, leaning forward. "Or old, or out of my mind. Is that the story you're preparing?" They didn't answer, but their silence was enough. I walked to the counter and picked up my notebook, holding it up so they could see. Every word is written down. Every time, every conversation, every witness. "If you think you can silence me, you're mistaken." Daniel's voice cracked just a little. "Mom, please. We're asking you nicely." I looked at my son, the boy I raised, the man I had defended countless times, and I realized this was no longer about a misunderstanding. This was about control. "You've stopped asking nicely," I said. "Now you're trying to intimidate me." "That ends here," Amanda scoffed. "Intimidate you? Don't be dramatic." "Dramatic is throwing your mother's life out onto the porch," I said. "Dramatic is leaving a note instead of speaking to me face to face. Dramatic is pretending to be the victim when you're the one who caused the harm." The room went still. Even the old clock in the corner seemed to hesitate before ticking again. Daniel rubbed his temples. "If you can't drop this, then we're going to have to take other steps." My voice was ice. "Other steps like what?" "Amanda's tone turned smug, like talking to the Hoa about your behavior, about the fact that you've been causing disturbances. We can make life very difficult for you here. I laughed, an actual, genuine laugh. Amanda, I've lived through more difficult than you can imagine. I've raised a child alone. I've buried friends. I've worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. You think a letter from the Hoa is going to scare me? She didn't answer, but her glare said plenty. I'll tell you what, I said, placing the notebook back on the table. You do what you feel you need to do, and I'll do the same. Only difference is, mine will be the truth, and the truth doesn't go away just because you don't like it. Daniel looked like he wanted to say more, but Amanda grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. When the door shut behind them, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the surge of energy that comes when you stand your ground. I knew what they were trying to do. They wanted me isolated, cut off from allies, worn down until I gave up. But they had underestimated me. A woman who has had everything taken from her doesn't cling to fear, she clings to truth. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls, 1 to the church council, 1 to a local reporter who owed me a favor, and 1 to my lawyer. I didn't know exactly what the next steps would be, but I knew one thing: silence was no longer an option. If they wanted to fight, I would give them one. The morning sun in Texas does not rise quietly. It floods every corner with a golden light. That forces you to face the day whether you are ready or not. That morning, I was ready. I had waited weeks for this, and every ounce of patience I had left was packed into the bag sitting by my front door. I stood in my kitchen, sipping coffee slowly, watching the steam curl up toward the ceiling. My heart was not racing. My hands were steady. I had thought I might feel nervous, but instead, I felt the way a storm feels before it breaks, calm, heavy, inevitable. When I heard the truck pull into the driveway, I did not rush to the door. I let them wait. The sound of a car engine cutting off, the creak of a door opening, and slow footsteps on the gravel, all of it was music to my ears. They had no idea what was coming. It was Jacob, my son, and his wife, Tiffany, my own blood, and the woman who had pushed me out of my own home. They had arrived without calling, maybe assuming I would still be the mother who rushed to greet them with open arms. Not today. I opened the door just as Jacob was lifting his hand to knock. His smile faltered when he saw me. Tiffany stayed behind him, her arms crossed, already bracing for a fight. "Mom," Jacob said, his voice caught between polite and strained. "We thought we'd come by and talk." "Talk," I repeated, my voice flat. "You mean the kind of talk you had when you left my belongings on the porch with a thank you note?" His shoulders dropped. Tiffany's eyes rolled slightly, but I caught it. My blood simmered. "We didn't mean for it to happen that way," Jacob said. "It was just, things were moving fast, fast enough to throw away 30 years of family history," I replied. I stepped aside, not to let them in, but to let my words hit harder. "And yet here you are, thinking you can explain it away over coffee." Tiffany stepped forward. "Look, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. We needed the house. You weren't using it." I cut her off sharply. "That house was mine, paid for with my hands, my back, my years of teaching other people's children while raising my own. And you didn't ask. You didn't even face me. You left me a note." Jacob looked down at the porch floorboards. For the first time in months, he seemed like the boy I raised, ashamed, cornered. But shame would not be enough. "I came to tell you," I said slowly, "that everything you thought you took from me is already gone from your hands." They looked confused. Tiffany spoke first. "What are you talking about?" I reached for the folder sitting on the side table and handed it to Jacob. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. "Bank documents, property transfers, legal notices." "You sold the ranch?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "I sold everything," I said. "The ranch, the second plot of land, even the oil rights. Every penny is locked away where neither of you will ever touch it. And I moved into a place of my own. I don't owe you anything now. Not a roof, not an inheritance, not even an explanation." Jacob's face turned pale. Tiffany's lips tightened. "You can't just..." Tiffany began, but I stopped her cold. I can, I said firmly, and I did. You made it clear that I was no longer part of your family when you sent my belongings out like garbage. So I have returned the favor. Consider this the end of our shared history. Jacob stepped closer, his voice low. Mom, you don't mean that. I do, I said without hesitation. I mean every word. The silence between us grew heavy. I could feel the weight of all the years, all the memories, pressing down. But this was not the time for tears. This was the time for truth. You wanted me gone from your life, I said, and you succeeded. But don't come knocking here again, expecting forgiveness like it's your right. Forgiveness is earned, and you've done nothing to deserve it. Jacob swallowed hard. Tiffany glanced at him, looking for some kind of plan, but he had none. They left without another word. I watched their truck pull away, the dust rising behind it in the hot Texas air. When the road was empty again, I closed my door and locked it. My home was mine, my life was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I walked back into the kitchen, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat at the table. Outside, the light was bright, and the world felt wide open again. I knew the final scene of this story was coming soon, but for now, I allowed myself the rare luxury of peace. I sat at my kitchen table that morning. The same kitchen where, months ago, I used to cook Sunday breakfasts for them. The air smelled of fresh coffee, but my hands were trembling around the mug. There was something I needed to do before the day ended. The porch incident was behind me in days, but not in spirit. That note, short, cold, signed with nothing more than "thanks for everything," still rested in my dresser drawer, pressed between the pages of my Bible. I had not decided if keeping it was a form of strength or weakness. But now, looking at the morning sun pouring across the table, I knew I needed to answer it. Not with an argument, not with anger, but with something final. I pulled out a pen and the thickest sheet of stationery I owned. My handwriting had always been neat, the kind that teachers used to hang on bulletin boards when I was in grade school. Now, the letters looked like they carried the weight of every sleepless night since that day. I began, "Dear Matthew and Laura, you left my belongings on the porch. You left my heart on it too." I thought about asking why, but now I see the answer is simple. I was no longer wanted. So I will make this equally simple. I forgive you, but I will not return. The words came slower after that. Forgiveness was not easy, but it was the only key I had to lock the door on the pain. I wrote about the times I had stood by them, even when I had nothing to give but my time. I reminded them of the nights Matthew had been sick as a child, how I slept on the floor beside his bed, counting the seconds between his breaths. I told them how Laura once sat across this very kitchen table and cried about her mother's passing, and how I held her hand until her sobs turned to quiet. But I did not write these things to guilt them. I wrote them so they could see that what they threw away was not furniture or clothes, it was the years of love, small and large, that had been woven into every gesture. When I finished, my hand ached. I read the letter twice, sealed it in an envelope, and drove into town. I did not mail it. Instead, I walked into the attorney's office and handed it to him. "Include this with the documents," I said. He looked puzzled. "This isn't legal paperwork." "No," I said, "it is the last word I will ever give them. They can read it when they realize what they lost. And if they never read it, then it will sit in your files as proof that I left with dignity." He nodded, slid the envelope into a file folder, and shut the drawer. The sound of that drawer closing was like a final door shutting in my heart. On my way home, I stopped at the feed store to pick up supplies. The owner, an old friend, greeted me with a warmth I had not felt in months. We talked about the upcoming fair, about the weather, about nothing at all, but it felt like everything. I realized then that life still had room for joy. It just would not be with them. That evening, I sat on my porch, my new porch, not the one they had left me on, and watched the sun sink behind the mesquite trees. The cicadas sang in the distance, the air was warm, and I thought about how peace sometimes comes quietly, not with big victories or grand gestures, but with the knowledge that you survived something you thought might break you. I glanced at the empty rocking chair beside me and smiled. It no longer felt like a space. waiting to be filled. It was just a chair, part of my home, part of my life. And in that moment, I knew I had stepped fully into the next chapter.